Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's Top 10 Movies of 2016. This video is where I count down my top 10 favorite movies that were released in 2016. So I've seen exactly 31 movies this year, which is a fair amount, I guess, for the average Joe, but I'm not like these film critics you'll find on YouTube who have seen like over 80 or sometimes over 100 films that came out this year. So therefore, there will be a lot of movies I missed, so I'm sure there are some great films out there that I didn't get a chance to see, but if you know my channel, I'm more of a TV show kind of guy, so it's hard to find time to watch that many movies. Most of the movies I saw this year were due to the two videos I did mid-year, the top 10 summer blockbuster movies and the top 10 film festival films. And the first, I made a point to see at least 10 blockbuster movies that came out over the American summer, and the other, I made a point to see at least 10 films at the International Film Festival. So the last one will result in a lot of films that many may not have heard of, so I run the risk of coming off as hipster. But hey, I saw them, and if I liked them, and I thought they were among my favorites this year, I'm not going to pretend that they're not simply because a lot of people may not have heard of them. But I did see quite a few movies outside of those two videos, apparently 11 other movies. Now, last year, before doing my top 10 movie video, I made a point to watch at least 10 movies that came out towards the end of the year, or perhaps a bit earlier, that I missed, that all of the critics were raving about, and indeed one of those movies, Room, ended up being my number one. But this year I was a bit too busy to do that, so I only saw 3 movies that all the critics were raving about towards the end of the year. So I'm sure there'll be more 2016 movies I'll see later that I thought maybe should have been included on the list. And if there are enough of them, I might do another video about that. But for now, I'll just go with these 31 movies that I saw in 2016. But before I give my top 10 favorite movies, as traditional in my videos, I'm going to start off by giving my pick for worst movie of the year. And as I just mentioned, I'm not like a film critic who is forced to sit through every piece of crap that comes out. And in fact, I try to avoid bad movies, go figure. So my pick for worst movie of the year won't be nearly as bad as many that you'll find on these top 10 worst movie YouTube videos and whatnot. And I didn't see enough bad movies to make a list. Although I will say Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Out of the Shadows and Warcraft were also considered for this. But my pick for worst movie that I saw in 2016 is the BFG. Now, those who have seen my top 10 summer blockbusters of 2016 video would have already heard me rant about this movie, so I'll keep it brief. But this is the first movie I saw in a great many number of years in the movie theaters where I actively wanted to leave and walk out and had to force myself to sit and watch it. It was boring, and in fact, I'm pretty sure I did fall asleep for like 10 minutes during the course of the film. The characters weren't interesting. The story wasn't interesting. They introduced plot elements that came out of nowhere, and characters was like, oh, let's go see the Queen. Who never mentioned the Queen before in the entire film? It relied on cheap fart jokes, and it dragged out for far too long. It was dumb. It was just a dumb movie. I watched a couple of videos earlier this year where people were arguing over what was Steven Spielberg's worst movie. Well, some said movies like 1941 or War of the Worlds or Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull. I would actually say the BFG would be a very strong contender for that title, as I can't believe Spielberg would produce something so subpar, making it the worst movie I saw in 2016. Okay, so now getting into the best movies of the year. Before I get into my top 10, let me name a few honorable mentions that nearly made my list, but not quite. But are definitely good movies worth mentioning. First honorable mention is Green Room, a very high-tension, well-acted film with two Star Trek alumni, the late, great Anton Yelchin and Patrick Stewart. It did fall a bit too much into horror movie cliche territory for my taste, but overall, this film left an impression on me and was definitely a really scary thrill ride. Next honorable mention is Sully, the Clint Eastwood directed film starring Tom Hanks based on real-life events of an airplane pilot that managed to save a crashing plane by landing it safely in the Hudson River. This isn't the most thrilling or engaging movie out there, and its plot was a tad thin, but it certainly left an impact on me and did get me to sympathize with these characters and actually gave you the experience of what it must have been like to be in such a dire situation. This movie just felt so real rather than having Hollywood tropes, and it was certainly worth watching. And my final honorable mention is Doctor Strange. I still think it's a real shame I couldn't fit this onto my top 10, as although I wasn't blown away by this movie, as the plot did pretty much play out like a by-the-numbers Marvel movie, where I was hoping for a bit more originality, but the visuals were beyond amazing, definitely some of the best of the year, and the ending was so original, and it did break from the norm of the massive skybeam fights you tend to find in comic book movies. And I loved it, and I thought it was a great original way to end the film, and the only thing I'm going to say about that is Dormammu, I've come to bargain. So now getting into my top 10 favorite movies of 2016, starting with my number 10, Deadpool. Now Deadpool is a comic book movie that surprised everyone, including myself, although many would have it much higher on their list than I do, because honestly I don't think it is as great as many make it out to be, but it is most definitely a solid film with a great structure, very unique and interesting characters, and of course very funny. It breaks with all sorts of normal conventions, including how it constantly breaks the fourth wall, which apparently is true to the comic book character. The plot is a tad thin, but let's be honest, this movie isn't about plot, it's about comedy, good, strong, relatable, and funny characters, and it delivers in spades. Coming in at number 9 on my list is Midnight Special, an innovative science fiction movie that flew kind of under the radar as I saw it at the International Film Festival, but it obviously had a sizable budget, or at the very least managed to do quite a bit with the small budget that it had, as the effects are great. Midnight Special is a good road trip movie where two parents and a friend are trying to get their son, who has some special abilities and powers, and thus is highly sought after by the government, to a destination across the country. And in that way, the film is very reminiscent of one of my all-time favorite movies, Starman. It was a very powerful movie that was really super suspenseful and very touching, with some great acting. But frankly, this movie would have been higher on my list had it had a better start, as to me the film seemed to skip the first act and jumped immediately into the second act. And I found this a bit jarring and disorientating, and it made it a tad bit hard for me to get that attached to the characters, so that did hold it back for me a bit. But it was still a very powerful and unique movie, and I'm likely to watch it again multiple times. Number 8 on my list is A War, a Danish film that I saw at the International Film Festival. A War stars, well, hell, I won't even bother to try to say the actor's name and just say Euron Greyjoy, as I'm sure those who watch my channel will know him as Euron Greyjoy. Anyway, it stars Euron Greyjoy in a subtle performance that I think is amazing. And the thing about this movie is that the plot doesn't really kick in until like halfway through the movie, so I feel it's a bit of a spoiler to describe the plot, but suffice to say, it's about a family man serving in the Danish army in Afghanistan, Afghanistan and some things that he has to face as commander of his unit, who balances wanting to make it home to his family. And I will say the second half of the film is so powerful, it does totally justify the first half. Is when you first watch it, the first half kind of comes off as boring and pointless, but once you see the whole thing, you see it completely is necessary for setting up a very powerful finale that truly describes the complexities of war and how nothing is as black and white as one may think. That had me questioning everything I thought I knew about war. So overall, a very emotionally powerful and thought-provoking film. Coming in at number 7 is Rogue One, a Star Wars story. Speaking of war movies, Rogue One is an original spin on the Star Wars universe by showing a more gritty and morally gray side of the war with the rebellion fighting against the Empire. It does come off more like a war movie, but while at the same time giving you that same feeling you love about Star Wars. This film had the best use of comedy in any Star Wars film, in my opinion, with the character of K2SO, who is a very interesting and well done character, and the comedy blended seamlessly into the serious tone of the film. And in my opinion, this film features the best action sequences of any Star Wars film, as I was totally blown away by them, as well as having many great Easter eggs and callbacks for those of us who are Star Wars fans and have seen the original movies a billion times, including some totally kick-ass and amazing Darth Vader sequences. But the characters in the film were kind of flat and not developed as much as they could have been, and the plot was too heavily dependent on seeing A New Hope and didn't stand on its own as much as I would have liked. But overall, definitely a high quality film and a great watch. Number 6 on my list is Star Trek Beyond. Those familiar with my channel may know I'm not a huge fan of the Abrams Star Trek reboots, so this film surprised me because it's the first of the reboots I actually felt like Star Trek, and more than that, it was actually really good and an absolutely fun ride. The character stories really shine through, as unlike the previous reboots, the characters were fleshed out. They really worked for the film, as well as introducing some great new characters like Jayla, who was an amazing addition to the cast. And the action sequences were amazing, and unlike the previous two reboots, did not overload the senses and actually serviced the plot. And overall, this was a well-structured, fun movie with really great developed characters, and again, another movie that managed to throw in a lot of sort of Easter eggs and fun stuff for the fans that take absolutely nothing away from those who aren't as familiar with the franchise. But the villain of the film was a bit flat and cliched, and he didn't work very well, and his backstory felt a bit convoluted, but overall, still a really enjoyable film. Number 5 on my list is X-Men Apocalypse. I already did several videos on how unfair I believe the critics are to this film, and it's actually much better than many of them give it credit for. I will say I was personally blown away by this film, which isn't an easy task, and I think is what really got me was the strong character stories that really grabbed me and I could latch onto. And personally, I think that it worked better in this film than any other X-Men film and most other superhero movies in existence. The strong character stories gave depth to what in other films is just the run-of-the-mill, over-the-top action set pieces, but in this film really worked because the rich characters added depth and dynamic to it. On top of that, it had several amazing, mind-blowing scenes, such as the Quicksilver scene and the Wolverine scene. I will say there was one small story point at the end that kind of bothered me, and some of the suspension of disbelief was a bit over the top, but frankly, that's what you would expect to see in any comic book movie. So I have to say, this is one of my favorite comic book movies of all time, and it was my favorite comic book movie of the year. I don't care what anyone else says about it. Next, my number 4 is Love Song, another film I saw at the International Film Festival that most people probably haven't heard of, as the critical response wasn't mind-blowing, as it received mostly mildly positive reviews. However, for some reason, this film really resonated with me, which is unusual indeed, as it is a slow-paced slice of life film, which are typically the type of films I don't care for. Love Song is directed by So Young Kim, who apparently has directed several other celebrated indie films that I haven't heard of, and it stars Riley Keough and Jenna Malone, whom I recognize as playing Gretchen in Donnie Darko. And it tells the story of two 20-something women who were friends since high school. One of them is married with a young daughter, who meet and have a brief romance that ends kind of awkwardly. Then many years later, they speak again for the first time after one has divorced and the other is about to get married. Even though this is a quiet, understated film that uses very little dialogue, another trait I typically don't like in films, it actually speaks volumes on the complexity of interpersonal relationships and how they can affect individual emotions. And I just found it a very powerful and thought-provoking film. Coming in at number 3 for me is Nocturnal Animals, a powerful drama starring Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal about a woman who is unhappy with her life, who receives a novel that her ex-husband wrote. And the film follows 3 stories: the woman's current life, flashbacks with her ex-husband, and the story of the novel her ex-husband wrote. And these work in concert to tell a highly metaphorical story one has to really think about, and it's the type of film that you want to watch twice, and you're likely to pick up on more details when you do. Ironically, this isn't the first time an abstract film with Jake Gyllenhaal made my end of the year top 10 list, as 2 years ago he was also in Enemy. This film told a particularly powerful and understated story of the implications of the relationships and divorce, and it does so in such a way that is more emotional than logical. Some critics complained that the film is less than subtle with its visual clues, but I strongly disagree with those complaints, as I feel obvious visual clues aren't the same as obvious verbal clues, and are by nature more subtle, and are in fact exactly what an abstract film like this needs. That also, and the way it features amazing acting by everyone involved, made me absolutely love this film. My number 2 of 2016 is Arrival. I really wanted to do a review for Arrival when I first saw it, but alas, I was far too busy at the time, so perhaps I'll do a detailed review once it's released on Blu-ray. Arrival is a film all the critics were ranting and raving about, but I was a bit skeptical, as the critics have failed me in the past, but I knew I had to check it out, and it actually delivered in spades. One might note this is the second Amy Adams film to appear in my top 5, and indeed she is vastly becoming my new favorite actress who's working today. She was absolutely amazing in this film and deserves at the very least an Oscar nomination. This film was a very smart, well thought out science fiction. While although it was a bit slow moving, it was very intellectual and very well had very well fleshed out characters. This film is tension film, but more quiet spoken and drama based, as it doesn't have any of the over the top action set pieces, and in fact very little action to speak of. And it still manages to tell a really intriguing and super engaging science fiction story of aliens visiting Earth. And indeed, the twist at the end was absolutely mind-blowing, and one of the best twists in film history, in my opinion, and really brought a lot of depth to this film, making it my second favorite movie of 2016. And my number 1 favorite movie of 2016 is Captain Fantastic. Captain Fantastic is not a superhero movie, but another indie film that I saw at the International Film Festival, but one that's well known and has received several Golden Globe nominations, and I really hope it snags a couple of Oscar nods, including for Best Picture, mainly because it would bring more attention to this film, which it totally deserves. Captain Fantastic stars Viggo Mortensen and is about an eccentric man who raises his family of 6 children with his wife in an unusual unusual way, living in the middle of the forest and hunting most of their own food and making all of their own material, while having a strict regimen of exercise and intellectual learning. The film begins with the death of his wife and the mother of the family, and deals with the family traveling to her funeral and the adventure they go through when dealing with the real world. Part of the reason I love this film so much is for personal reasons, as the philosophy this family has is one I strongly agree with, although they take it in an unhealthy extreme, and the film does a great job of neither pumping these philosophies up as the greatest thing ever, nor putting them down as totally idiotic. It shows the positives and negatives of this particular alternative lifestyle and way of raising a family that's mainly really fascinating to see in a true fish out of water story. I believe most audiences could relate to this story regardless of their own personal philosophy. And more than that, it's a funny film with many great comedic moments, while at the heart of it having a richly emotional and relatable story that is told in a realistic and fascinating way. The acting in this film is amazing, and the characters come off as very well developed and dynamic. In a way, it reminds me of other quirky indie comedies like Little Miss Sunshine, but in my humble opinion is vastly superior to them, as everything in this film just works so well, as I laughed throughout this film, and the funeral scene at the end brought me to tears, and there were moments of tension where I feared for the characters, and there were moments where I wanted to get up and cheer, and other moments that warmed my heart. And for me, that is the best you could ask for in a film, so I think it's safe to say I will consider Captain Fantastic one of my all-time favorite movies, definitely making it my #1 favorite movie of 2016. So that's it for my top 10 favorite movies of 2016. Stay tuned for my channel, as later in the week I continue to celebrate the best of 2016 with my top 10 favorite TV shows of 2016. Also, be sure to keep an eye out on my channel as I continue to do a random movie review here and there, as well as doing many more videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Vikings, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.